All right, today we get to talk to Andre, K6AH from the AREDNmesh.org networking team for AREDN. The AREDN is an acronym, Amateur Radio Emergency Data Network. And if you attend Dayton Hamvention, they have a booth set up every year. They have a tower outside with an IP cam on it, and they do demonstrations in their booth, little 10 to 15, maybe 20-minute segments inside of their booth where they do kind of mini forums in there to talk about what's new at Norton, what it does. They give intros. They do one or two sessions in the regular forum hall that are like 45 or 50-minute sessions, and we're going to cover some of that during the YouTubers Hamfest on May 23rd. But today, Andre is going to give us one of his more specialized briefings that would have been done in the booth at Hamvention if Hamvention were actually happening this year. So today he's going to tell us about plotting AREDN nodes and doing predictions with an application called Radio Mobile, where you can take an area and take an AREDN node and put it all into this software and kind of see what the coverage would be so that you can make plans to get coverage in specific areas with specific radios and kind of blanket the AREDN mesh signal over whatever area you want it in. So stay tuned, and it's coming up.
Shut up and sit down.
All right, good morning. This is a segment on using Radio Mobile for designing an AREDN network. And sort of as background, you may have found yourself in a position where, you are one of maybe several hams in the community that have started experimenting with the technology, AREDN technology. Maybe there are some MCOM groups in the area that have heard about AREDN and think they maybe want one, but are waiting for people to build one. And you come along and want to be the person who builds it. So in order to get started with that, then you will want to take care of or start to inventory what is already going on with respect to AREDN technology in your area. And maybe there are one or more AREDN mesh islands that have started to get built. Maybe you could foresee maybe a Red Cross Ham group or an Ares group or RACES, OGSCOM, maybe even some local CERT teams that could benefit from deployed AREDN technology. And so the first step would be then to take all the things that exist and you could imagine would benefit from the network and plot them on a map. Now, I'm going to use San Diego County as an example throughout this presentation because I know it well. I live in the Carlsbad area of northern San Diego County. And I want to go through each of these red shaded areas and explain why I selected them. And I'll start in the very top left-hand corner in the Fallbrook area. Now, Fallbrook is an underserved area within San Diego County. They always seem to be the last area to get services by the county. And maybe not so coincidentally, they have a very active ham group who always step up to the plate and provide MCOM for even the slightest of disasters. They're well-trained, they're fairly well-educated, and in fact, I was a member of that group up there for many years. And anyway, that was definitely an area I wanted to serve. The next area down stretches from Carlsbad to Escondido. And there was an existing AREDN mesh island there. There are also two major trauma centers there, so I know that if I was going to be appealing to any of the MCOM groups in San Diego County, I would definitely need to have coverage into those trauma centers, so that was important to me. And then there's a coastal strip from Oceanside down to the La Jolla area. And that area already had 3 CERT groups that had been playing around with AREDN in one form or another. And so that was important to make sure that I covered. And then moving down further into the San Diego proper area, that shaded area includes the county EOC, Red Cross chapter headquarters, and so forth. That was obviously a very important area I needed to cover. And then down in the bottom left-hand corner, just north of the Mexican border, in the Chula Vista area, there was an existing mesh island down there. I think it was started by a couple of military folks who had been using mesh technology in their work in the military. And so they had quite a bit of a head start with that kind of technology, and they had set up a mesh island down in that area. And then moving east across the border, the next area I wanted to cover is an area called Del Sur and Campo. And the reason I wanted to cover this is because of all the major disasters we have had since I've lived in San Diego. Most had been fires, and most of the fires have started or have severely impacted this part of the county. So I wanted to be sure to cover that because without fail, the Red Cross would be setting up shelters in that area and so forth. And then lastly, off to the far right, El Centro, which is actually in Imperial County, but also represents another Red Cross headquarters out there. So I wanted to be sure to cover that area. Okay, so that gives you kind of a map. You can call them your requirements map because it represents those areas you want coverage. Okay, so I said we were going to use Radio Mobile, and there are 2 versions of Radio Mobile. There's a standalone PC version, and there's also an online version, which is much easier to use. Doesn't take any of the tedious configuration effort than as the standalone PC version, and much easier to use. So you would go to Radio Mobile Online. You would find that by Googling Radio Mobile Online, and you would eventually make your way to this sign-on page. And over here on the left, you click this Create a New Account and go through a process of getting signed up. Now, Radio Mobile, this online version is intended for ham use only, and so there are features and functions in here that are restricted by frequency to those bands that are allocated for amateur radio. So they want to avoid commercial users like wireless ISPs and so forth using this tool as a way of modeling their commercial networks. Before we get into the actual use of Radio Mobile, I just want to cover the 4 major groups of menu items. They're color-coded for you, so it really isn't difficult to keep them clear in your head. You'll notice that each of the first 3 groups anyway has a new, my, and multiples. So the first group has to do with sites, the next group links, the next group coverages, and each of those has a new, a my, and a multiple. And we'll start using those here in just a minute. But the red area for sites, this is an area where you define the location of where you're going to have your radios, your AREDN nodes. And you define things like the lat and lon. Actually, more easily, you locate them on the map, and it computes the latitude and longitude of where you drop the pin. You name the site for future reference, and it computes, determines for you the elevation above sea level that that plot or that pin is placed. The next group is the links group of menu items, and in the links you define things like antenna gain, you define azimuth or what direction you're pointing the antenna, the power your radio is going to be transmitting. And it determines for you the fade margin, or the signal to noise ratio of the resultant link. And we'll play with that a little bit so you understand how that works. And then the last of these three first major categories is coverages. And in coverages, you'll define antenna pattern coverage and radio power and so forth. Now, in this last area, it's a little different. It's called antennas, and it's where where you find your antenna pattern library. Now, what's an antenna pattern library? It's a list of, or I should say, it's a file structure of antenna definitions and their radiation patterns. So we'll have a look at that here in just a second. It's really quite interesting. So what you want to do is you want to find on the web the website that Ubiquity has set up to distribute their antenna pattern files, and then look through those files and upload into Radio Mobile the antennas that you want to use. And our examples are going to be Rocket Dish and the Rocket sector, as we'll see in just a second. So if I were to Google Ubiquity antenna pattern files, at the very first hit would be what you're looking for, and it looks something like this. And you can see that in the left column, they've described the product family. You see sectors there. You see a Rocket Dish product family there, and then the product model numbers. The first one, for example, is the Rocket Dish 3 gigahertz 25 dB dish. You can see the popular one, at least popular from my perspective, is the Rocket Dish 5 gigahertz 30 dB gain. And then on the far right-hand column then are the links for downloading those data files, and they come down as zip files. And then you would, let me go ahead and do that. And bear with me here a second.
That's fine.
Let me get logged in here. So if I were to if I were to have downloaded those from the Ubiquity site, then what I could do is I could click Choose File, and where those downloaded to and where I unzipped them to, I would find, for example, a 5 gigahertz 19 dB 120 degree sector, and I would see that there are 4 files here. I can ignore 3 of them. I can ignore these MSI files because those are Microsoft installation packages, which we're not interested in. We're only interested in these .ant or antenna files, and you'll see there's an H polarization and a V polarization. If you know anything about AREDN networking, you know that these nodes, most of them are MIMO, and they operate in both horizontal and vertical polarization planes independently. So select one. They're virtually identical, so you really can't go wrong. And then you click Upload to Server, which I won't do because, frankly, I've already uploaded these, and you'll see those in just a second. But that's how you upload these antennas. And they have antenna patterns not just for the rocket sectors and rocket dishes, but even things like nanostations and nanobeams. All of those are described by these patterns as well. Okay. So what we want to do next then is to define the site. Oh, I think it's worth doing this. Hang on a second. I want to show you the various antenna types that I've uploaded, And let's just look at one of them. Like, well, here's that 19 dB, 120 degree horizontally polarized sector. And I'm going to click Draw Antenna Pattern. And this is what the data file described. And so this is in the, this is looking down from the very top of the antenna to an antenna that's pointed directly north. And it is 120 degrees. So if you go from 300 degrees through 360 plus another 60 degrees, you've got this 120 degree radiation pattern. And of course, it isn't triangular. It's it's oblong, and you can see at the 6 dB point on each side is where the endpoints of it are. So they call that 120 degree coverage. And then looking at the radiation pattern from the side, if this is on the mountaintop and this is where your users are out here, you can see that there's a little down tilt. It's not really exactly horizontal. It actually drops from the horizontal down 4.5 degrees maybe. And of course, there are some smaller side lobes that you can ignore. But for the most part, it's this little tiny 4-degree swatch across a 120 degree span that represents that sector antenna. And it'll use these patterns to show you the coverage of these radios across the terrain. So that's why they're important. And you can learn all kinds of things about antenna radiation patterns by just poking around this stuff. So now back to where I was. So the next thing we're going to do then is we're going to define the sites. We're going to define a site. I'm actually not going to define all of them, but I have predefined them. And so you'll see if we apply the same things we learn about creating a single site record, we'll understand how all the rest of them were created. Then we're going to create links between sites. We'll choose two and see how you actually create a link between them. And we'll define the AREDN device that we're going to be using at each of these. And then we're going to combine all these links together into a visual representation of our backbone. All right, so going back to Radio Mobile, I am going to set up a new site. And it looks like I'm out in the middle of the ocean. I was actually out in the middle of the Salton Sea. That's another story altogether. And I'm going to put this thing down near Mount Otay on the south, and you'll understand why in a minute. And Mount Otay is about right there, not far from Doghouse Junction. And I click Submit, and you'll notice that it has computed the latitude and longitude. It's told me what the elevation above sea level is for that site. And it's asking me to name the site. And I generally, just to keep my head clear on this, I give the description and the name the same thing. And I click Add to my sites. That is how you set up a location. Now, I'm not actually going to do that because I already have Otay set up as a site. I call it Test Otay. There is all the information it has on Test Otay site. So now that you know how to do that, let's go back to the main menu and look at links. I'm going to create a link from test OTI to another site that I created just before as I was putting together this presentation, called Test Palomar. And it asks me things like what antenna height the meters above ground test OTI is, and I'm going to put in 20 meters. That would be the actual where on the tower it sits. Same thing with Test Palomar. I'm going to call this Test Palomar OTI. I'm going to put in a frequency, 5825, and I'm going to put in the following parameters. Now, I'm going to go over these again, so you don't really need to note them right now, but the power of these devices is about 24 dBm or a quarter watt. So I plug in a quarter watt for that. The line loss, when you use Ubiquiti rockets, they have a little 4, 5, 6 inch coaxial jumper that gets used, and so there's loss in that jumper and the connectors associated with it. So I put in a half a dB loss. A half a dB really doesn't make a huge difference in the calculations, but I habitually put it in because it's the same number every time, and it's easy to remember. And I'm using rocket dishes here on the link, so I know those are 30 dB gain on each end, both the transmitter and the receiver end. And the receiver is going to have a similar line loss as the transmitter did up here, half a dB. And then I know the receive threshold, or I computed the receive threshold in microvolts, and I know that it's 4, and that is the equivalent of 95 dBm or negative 95 dBm, which is the published receiver sensitivity of the Ubiquiti radios. Actually, it varies a little from 94 to minus 96. This minus 95 number seems like it's a good one to use. And then required reliability, I keep at 70%. It's really a probability kind of a figure. I'm not going to get into it. If you just stick with 70, you'll get good results. You'll just have to trust me on that one. And then I'm going to submit. And what it's doing now is it's computing the link between the two. And you can see here's our OTI site. Here's our Palomar site over to the right. You can see we've got clear path all the way. These little white lines, which are hard to see because of how far back we are looking at this thing. But those are the Fresnel zones, and the 3 of them are pictured there. So you also can see that there's clear Fresnel all the way through, which is good. And there's just a ton of information here. We can see things like, certainly all the things, the parameters we entered. We can see that the free space loss, in other words, the amount of signal strength we lose across the entire path, is 145.7 dB. We have a total path loss, including obstructions and other things, at 151 dB. The distance of the link is almost 80 kilometers or 50 miles. And we see the resultant fade margin is almost 27 dB, which is terrific. And if we, for argument's sake, would call this signal to noise ratio instead of fade margin, that would result in 27 dB of signal to noise, which would probably result in a 50 megabit per second data rate across that. So it's a great link. All right, so now that we know how to do that, we can either add it to my links. We can go back and modify this particular link, changing a parameter, or we can return to the main menu. I'm not actually going to add it because, as I'm sure you figured out by now, I've created all these in advance. So I'm going to return to the main menu. Okay. So what I've done then is I've plotted this backbone. This is Palomar, this is OTI. This is the link that we just completed modeling. I've also modeled links out to Laguna. I've modeled it to Soledad from Palomar and to San Marcos Peak from Palomar, and also from San Marcos Peak to points north, where I have other implementers within Southern California that I want to integrate the San Diego network with. Excuse me. Okay, so let's remember that, let's remember that we have modeled just the backbone at this point. So backbones are point-to-point links, but at each backbone site, we also have a radio that does distribution down to the lower levels. And in this case, this illustrates a link down to a deployed ham who is at a shelter or at a hospital or wherever. And because this is a sector antenna, it's actually operating in a point-to-multipoint mode. So I just want to illustrate the distinction between the point-to-point ones that we just modeled and the point-to-multipoint, which is what we're going to model here in just a minute. As visual examples of this, this picture on the left is over Simi Valley, northwest of Los Angeles, and you can see in the lower left-hand corner a high-gain dish that represents the point-to-point link to the backbone. And there's a couple sector antennas here. I suspect one is on 5 gigahertz and maybe the other one on 2. One is here and one is up here. They also appear to have a surveillance camera here. And then the illustration on the right is Mount Otay, just north of the Mexican border on the southern end of San Diego County. And again, you have a dish here, high gain dish, that this one does in fact point to Palomar, which we modeled earlier, and the 120-degree sector antenna just above it that distributes the network down to the lower lying areas. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go define the coverage patterns for a site. So we'll have to define the antennas that are going to be in use and define the direction we're going to want to point them. All right, if I want to set up a new coverage, I click New Coverage, and I pick the site that I'm going to do coverage from, and I'm going to use Otay. And Otay is at the 20-meter point. The antenna I'm going to use is a 5 gigahertz 19 dB 120-degree sector antenna. And let's say I'm going to point it, for argument's sake, I don't know, 280 degrees maybe. I'm not going to put any tilt on it. Now I could tilt the antenna slightly downward, and if you know, I really don't want to waste a lot of energy going too far out beyond a planned coverage area. So I could, for example, put a degree or two of additional down tilt on the antenna, remembering that the antenna pattern has a 2 or 3 degree down tilt already built into it. Just for grins, I'll leave it at 0. The gain of that antenna I know to be 19 dB. It's that 5G19, that's what the 19 signifies. And then on the receiving end of this, what am I going to be using? I'm going to suggest I'm going to have something at the 3-meter mark, and it's going to have a gain of about 20. So this would be a smaller dish that you have mounted on a mast somewhere. And I'm going to give this coverage a name. I'm going to give it a frequency, 5825. And remember that we're running a 1/4 watt. And remember that our transmit line loss is 0.5 dB. Receive line loss is also 0.5 dB. And our receive threshold is 4 microvolts. 70% we're going to leave, and you can leave the rest of these too. Although I will make a comment about the range. This is will default to 100 kilometer range. In other words, it'll calculate data points out to the equivalent of 62 miles. Now that may be way further than it needs to be. I'll go ahead and leave it at 100, but the farther you make this, the longer the calculation takes. Also, the higher resolution you want the results to be also substantially increases the calculation time. So we'll leave it at low resolution, and then we'll click submit. And you can see there's one calculation being processed. That would be mine. On busy days, you might see 2, 3, 4, and 5 simultaneous calculations being performed. Those are just other hams that are doing modeling at the same time as you. And they're inversely proportional to, or I should say the count is proportional to how long the calculation will take to perform. You can see it's almost done. And if we go out or zoom in on that, here's the OTI site, and here you can see coverage throughout San Diego. And I'm not going to save this one, of course, because I've already modeled it. And there's more that I want to do with OTI. But you can actually get down to a pretty granular level and see what city blocks are covered and which aren't. So there's definitely value there. I'm going to return now to the main menu because I want to come back and look at multiple coverages this time. And I actually have a slide for that. So I'm going to go back. And here you can see the coverage into San Diego from OTI. This is Soledad. This is San Marcos Peak. This is Palomar. And this is Laguna. And if you overlay that with our original requirements, you'll see that Fallbrook is reasonably well covered. This corridor between Carlsbad and Escondido is well covered. The coast is well covered. San Diego's got reasonable coverage. The Chula Vista down to the border is excellent in coverage. And then out here in El Centro, you would likely have to find a sweet spot in the area, but you could get coverage into there from this plan as well. And by the way, the yellow areas are still potentially viable. They just happen to be 10 dBs worse off in signal to noise than the green areas. And that is a parameter you can massage if you want. So the one big gaping hole here, which you're looking at and you're wondering why I haven't mentioned yet, is this area down here that I described as being the Dulcura area, where fires always seem to spark, and there's always Red Cross shelters. We didn't do a very good job. I didn't do a very good job of covering that area. So we need to go back and do that. And this gets a little complicated, and I'm hoping I can keep it simple enough for you. But if I go to multiple coverages, and I start out by looking at the OTI coverage and the Dulcura coverage. I'll explain that in a second. So what I did is let me take out the OTI. So what I did is I modeled if a radio was set up at the shelter in Dulcura, where would that coverage get me? In other words, if this is a nano station maybe that's pointed in whatever direction, where would I be able to communicate with? And as you can see, I mean, aside from maybe parts down south of the border, there isn't a lot that it does cover, but maybe it's enough. So what I did is I said, where in these green patches do I also have coverage to mount OTI? So the reason that's important is if I wanted to go from, let's say, OTI to one of these green patches, I could set up a relay node in one of these areas that would get me back to Dulcura. All right, so going back to multiple coverages now, I'm going to select OTI again, plus this time I'm going to select select an area I found that fulfills that requirement. Okay, so the green area is the OTI coverage. The red area is covered by a node that just so happened to be in both OTI's green area and the red area from Dulcura. So if I overlay those two, I can see that if I positioned, let's say, a temporary relay node on this street here called Emery Lane, I then could relay from this node from OTI to this node and then out to Dulcura, this area right here. So there is my relay solution, and I found it just in review. I found it by creating the pattern from Dulcura and overlaying that pattern with OTI, finding this little area here that was covered by both, and deciding that that's where I'm going to put a relay, and that would then cover Dulcura. I hope that wasn't too confusing. So let's go back and quickly review the parameters that I said were unique to AREDN. Frequency is what it is. It's the channel that you want to use. Now, power is always going to be a 1/4 watt for these radios. There are exceptions to that. There are even some microtick devices that are running upwards of a watt. Actually a 1/2 watt on each of the MIMO channels. You know, you use the specifications that are provided by the manufacturer for these values, but a 1/4 watt is a safe number for all of the AREDN devices. It's not going to be off by much. So and then a 1/2 dB of transmit line loss, a 1/2 dB of receive line loss, and a receive threshold of 4 microvolts, 70% for reliability, and the lowest maximum range here that best serves you. So that does it, and I appreciate your time, and I would ask that if you have any questions about how this works, you can get a hold of me on the AREDNmesh.org forum.
I feel like then that's creating more noise because it's
Cool.
time that now we've changed.
That's really good information. I haven't seen Radio Mobile
I figure what we should do is just
that dove into, is it diving or divin? Dived into that is dove into or dived into, whatever that word is. I haven't seen it in depth, that much in depth used in the past. So that's some really cool stuff you've got going there. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that there will probably be some questions put on the YouTube channel. So when it's when the episode posts, I'll send you a link to it, and you can go in there and look through the YouTube comments And if you have answers, if I have answers to something, I'll answer them. But most likely, you're going to be able to provide a better answer to some of that than I will. So,
Yeah, perfect.
but yeah, thanks a lot, Andre. Really appreciate that. And I'll get with you on what we do next for the live stream on the 23rd as well.
All right, very good. And thanks for the opportunity to present this. I appreciate it, Jason.
Certainly. Yeah. Thanks for your time today.